The year was 1910, and the wind howling across the frozen plains of Manchuria carried something far deadlier than the bitter cold. In the bustling city of Harbin, a railway hub connecting empires, people were dying with terrifying speed. It began with a fever, followed by a hacking cough that brought up blood dark as tar, and ended, inevitably, in death. The fatality rate was not just high, it was absolute. Whoever caught this sickness died. There were no survivors, not one. The world watched in paralyzed horror. To the great powers of the era, Russia, Japan, and France, this was not merely a humanitarian crisis, it was a geopolitical opportunity. They hovered like vultures, claiming that the Qing dynasty was too incompetent to manage a modern epidemic. If China could not control the outbreak, they argued, then foreign powers would have to step in and perhaps never leave. The medical consensus among the European experts stationed in the region was unanimous. This was the bubonic plague, the ancient scourge spread by rats and fleas. They ordered rat-catching campaigns and set out traps, confident in their superior Western knowledge. But the rats were healthy, and the people kept dying. The death toll climbed into the thousands, turning Harbin into a ghost town of boarded-up windows and silent streets. Into this frozen nightmare stepped Dr. Lien-teh. He was a man caught between worlds, born in Penang, educated at Cambridge, the first ethnic Chinese student to study medicine there. To the Chinese officials, he was too Western. To the Westerners, he was simply a colonial subject. Yet the Chinese government, desperate and out of options, appointed him to lead the fight against the plague. When Wu arrived in Harbin, he did not look at the rats. He looked at the families huddled together for warmth in the unventilated shacks of the slums. He saw a disease that leapt from father to mother, from brother to sister, without a flea in sight. Wu suspected the impossible. He believed the medical establishment was wrong. To prove it, he had to commit an act that was considered a grave crime against tradition and law, a post-mortem examination. In a secret, makeshift laboratory, risking his own life and reputation, Wu performed an autopsy on a plague victim. What he found in the bodily tissues changed everything. The lymph nodes, the primary target of the bubonic plague, were largely unaffected. Instead, the lungs were destroyed, teeming with Yersinia pestis. The conclusion was terrifying. This was not the bubonic plague. It was pneumonic plague. It didn't need rats. It didn't need fleas. It traveled on the breath of the living. It was airborne. Wu immediately realized that the current containment methods were useless. If the air itself was the weapon, then the shield had to filter the air. He designed a simple, layered defense, gauze and cotton wrapped securely around the face, a direct ancestor of the modern N95. It was a brilliant, elegant solution to an invisible problem. But when he presented his findings and his mask to the international medical community gathered in Harbin, he was met not with relief, but with derision. The idea that a disease could be airborne was considered fringe, almost superstitious, by the leading minds of the time. And the idea that a Chinese doctor could teach the West how to fight a plague, that was simply laughable. The world ignored his warning, and the clock continued to tick. The resistance to Dr. Wu's radical theory crystallized in the form of Dr. Gérald Mesny. A distinguished French epidemiologist with a towering reputation, Mesny had built his career fighting plagues across the colonies. He arrived in Harbin not to collaborate with Wu Lien-teh, but to replace him. To Mesny, Wu was an upstart, a young man whose Cambridge degree could not wash away the fact that he was, in the eyes of the European elite, racially inferior. The tension between the two men was not just professional, it was the collision of two eras, two worldviews. Their confrontation has been scrubbed from many official histories, but it remains one of the most pivotal moments in medical history.
In a meeting intended to coordinate the response, the conflict turned personal. Mesny, a large, imposing man, towered over the slighter Wu. He openly scoffed at the airborne theory. When Wu attempted to explain the pathology he had observed in the lungs, Mesny interrupted him. With a dismissive sneer that echoed the arrogance of an entire empire, he famously insulted Wu, questioning what could possibly be expected from a Chinaman. It was a calculated humiliation designed to put the colonial doctor in his place and reassert European dominance. Mesny declared that he would handle the outbreak the traditional way, by treating it as bubonic plague. He rejected the cotton masks as useless rags, symbols of fear rather than science. To prove his point and to publicly discredit Wu, Dr. Mesny decided to make a dramatic show of his fearlessness. He marched into the heart of the epidemic, the plague hospital where hundreds of patients lay dying. It was a theater of arrogance. He wore no mask. He took no respiratory precautions. He moved among the coughing, dying patients, examining them with the casual confidence of a man who believes his status creates a force field against reality. He believed he was hunting fleas. He did not realize he was walking into a cloud of invisible death. The tragedy unfolded with brutal speed. The very air in the ward was thick with the bacteria Mesny claimed couldn't fly. Every breath he took while mocking Wu's precautions was a game of Russian roulette. He examined patients who were coughing up the deadly sputum, leaning in close to listen to their chests, inhaling the microscopic droplets that Wu had warned him about. Mesny left the hospital feeling triumphant, believing he had exposed Wu as a fraud. But the biology of the plague cared nothing of his reputation or his race. Within hours, the fever struck. The headache came next, followed by the terrifying tightness in the chest. The great French doctor, who had laughed at the useless mask, found himself gasping for air in his luxury quarters. The bacteria had taken root in his lungs, just as Wu had predicted. The duel was over. Science had delivered its verdict, not in a debate hall, but in the bloodstream of the skeptic. The executioner was already inside him, and there was no appeal.
Dr. Gérald Mesny died less than 48 hours after his symptoms appeared. The shock of his death reverberated around the globe. It was a cold, hard slap to the face of the international medical establishment. A leading European expert, armed with the full confidence of Western medicine, had been struck down in days, while the Chinaman he had mocked remained alive, protected by his layers of cotton and gauze. Mesny's death was tragic, but it was also the grim evidence required to turn the tide. Suddenly, the laughter stopped. The Wu mask, previously ridiculed as a primitive accessory, became the most coveted item in Manchuria. Manufacturing ramped up immediately. Doctors, nurses, gravediggers, and police officers, everyone donned the white masks. It was the first time in history that a mask was used as a primary tool for epidemic control, a visual that would become the defining image of pandemics for the next century. But the mask alone wasn't enough to stop the momentum of the death that had already spread. The ground in Harbin was frozen solid, impenetrable to shovels. Thousands of corpses piled up in the streets, preserved by the cold, becoming grim reservoirs of the bacteria. As long as the bodies remained, the plague would thrive. Lien-teh made a decision that was even more controversial than his autopsy. He petitioned the imperial court for permission to perform a mass cremation. In Chinese culture, burning the dead was an unthinkable desecration. The ancestors had to be buried whole. But Wu argued that the living mattered more than the traditions of the dead. On January 31, 1911, the sky over Harbin turned black with smoke. Enormous pyres were lit, consuming thousands of plague victims. It was a scene from hell, but it was the act of salvation.
The combination of the masks, the quarantines, and the cremations broke the chain of transmission. Within months, the plague that had threatened to devour the world was extinguished. The death toll stopped at 60,000. It could have been millions. Lien-teh was hailed as the plague fighter. He chaired the International Plague Conference, sitting at the head of the table, while scientists from the nations that had once dismissed him took notes. He became the first ethnic Chinese person to be nominated for a Nobel Prize in medicine. Yet, as the decades passed, the West largely forgot him. The N95 mask became a standard piece of medical equipment, its origins in the desperate winter of Manchuria obscured by time. History books focused on Fleming and Pasteur, leaving Wu in the shadows. It wasn't until the world faced another airborne pandemic a century later that we remembered the man who first told us to cover our faces. Dr. Mesny's arrogance is a cautionary tale, but Dr. Wu's persistence is a beacon. He taught us that science does not belong to any one race or nation, and that sometimes the simplest barrier, a piece of cotton, is the only thing standing between civilization and silence. We remember him now, not just as a doctor, but as the man who stared down the apocalypse and forced it to blink.